In this series of videos, we'll take a look at using the database first features of Telerik OpenAccess ORM. In this first video, we'll take a look at the Create Model wizard. We'll get started by creating a new Telerik OpenAccess class library project, which will hold our domain model. We'll give our project a name, and then click OK. Now the Create Model wizard will automatically start. So the first thing we need to do is select the content for our rlink file. We can either start with an empty domain model, or we can populate our model from an existing database schema. Now we'll select a backend. As you can see, OpenAccess supports many different backend types. For this example, we'll use Microsoft SQL Server. Now we'll give our model a name, which is the name of the context that you'll use to access your entities. We'll call ours DB context. And now we'll specify the namespace for our model. We can use the default namespace from the project, or we can define a custom namespace for our model, which is very helpful when you have multiple data sources in your project. So we'll call ours demo namespace. Now we'll click Next. Now we need to set up our connection. We can select an existing connection from the Connections drop-down, or we can add a new connection by clicking Add New Connection, selecting our data source, clicking Continue, and entering our server information. Here we'll connect to SQL Express, and we'll enter AdventureWorks for the database. And once we have our database, we'll click OK. The third way to specify your connection string is to manually enter it in the box provided. And now we want to give our connection string a name, which is the name that will be used in the app config or the web config of your application. Once we specify a name, we can click Next. And now it's time to choose the database items that we'd like to include in our model. As you can see, we have all the tables and store procedures available in the database. At the top, we can filter by schemas. So if we add the person schema and the sales schema, you'll see that we now have more database objects available to us. Using the text box above the tree, we can search for items in the tree view. If we enter address, the first item found is highlighted for us. We can also hide tables, views, and store procedures. And we can group our objects by schemas, making it very easy to drill down and find specific objects related to a schema in the database. When working with schemas, one of the options available is to use schema names for the namespace. Selecting this option will group your objects into a namespace based on their schema in the database. Now we'll click Next and go on to define naming rules. The Naming Rules dialog enables you to specify various name settings that will be applied to your domain model as it is created from the database. The first group of settings allow us to control prefixes and suffixes for our generated objects. If we add a prefix, you can see in the lower section a preview of the generated class name. If we add a suffix, you'll see that the class name now has that suffix appended. We can also specify that we should remove prefixes or suffixes from our table names to generate the class names. So if we specify that we should remove a prefix, you'll see that the preview shows that we no longer start with those letters. Same goes for the suffix. We can specify multiple prefixes or suffixes to remove simply by separating the prefix with a comma or a semicolon. In this case, the wizard will remove the first letter in the names that start with C or E. We can also adjust the case of the generated class names. Upper will make the class names all uppercase. Pascal case will make the class names Pascal case. We can also specify pluralization of our class names. We can specify that we should pluralize or singularize class names. There are two ways you can tell the naming rules to handle underscores. The first is to remove all underscores, and the second is to tell it to interpret underscores as a word delimiter. The final option is to add the schema name as a prefix. You can use any of these settings for classes, fields, and property generation. There's an additional setting for fields and property generation, which allows you to control the pluralization of collections. Now we'll click Next and go on to some advanced options. Here you can specify a custom code generation template. This code generation template is what OpenAccess uses to create the entities. We'll go ahead and use the default. We can also specify if we would like to use an XML mapping or attribute-based mapping. We can specify whether or not we want a context to be generated. We can also specify whether or not we want our classes to be generated in multiple files, and we can specify the output location. Now we'll click Finish. Now the Visual Designer will open with our generated domain model. So for now, let's go ahead and close our domain model and take a look at the Solution Explorer. If we expand the References section, you can see that 2 Telerik OpenAccess references have been added to the project. In addition, an app config has been created, which specifies our connection string. And that connection string has the name that we specified in the earlier wizard. The wizard also generated an rlink file, which represents your domain model. If we take a look at some of the class names, you can see that the rules we applied in the Name Settings section have been applied to our class names. We specified that C and E should be removed, and you can see the top 4 classes show that that has happened. If we scroll down to the other classes in our domain model, you can see that their names are untouched. We can also see that all of our classes have been generated in the demo namespace we specified in the wizard. And finally, if we take a look at our context, you can see that it has the name we specified in the first page of the wizard, DB context. In this video, we took a look at how you can get started using some of the database first features available in Telerik OpenAccess ORM. The first step was to choose our model type. Then we specified our database connection. Next, we specified all database items we wanted to include in our domain model. And then we specified some naming rules for our generated entities. Finally, we took a look at some of the advanced options. In the next video, we'll take a look at how you can update a domain model based on changes in the database. Thank you for watching.